It's the second Sunday of Advent and the second sermon in a series called The Word Made Flesh. The title comes from the first chapter of John's Gospel, where it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." It's a reference to Jesus and the miracle of incarnation that we celebrate at Christmas. But in these Sundays leading up to Christmas, we are looking at the traditional Advent themes of hope, peace, joy, and love, and the way each of those words was made flesh in the person of Christ. Last week I talked to you about hope and suggested that those people who are most able to appreciate that word are the people who have been in situations that seemed almost hopeless. This week I want to talk to you about peace, and I think the same thing is true, that in order to appreciate it fully, you have to consider its opposite. But what is the opposite of peace? Is it war? And should we spend our time today talking about that? In some ways we couldn't hit on a more timely subject, but I think I want to talk to you about that kind of ordinary, everyday conflict that can crop up between two people, that can lead to anger and hurt feelings and stony silences, the kind of conflict that robs us of our peace. And that kind of conflict seems to come up often at Christmas. And it's no wonder. Christmas is the perfect recipe for that kind of conflict. Just look at the ingredients. Put together some people who haven't been together for a while, who may not get along with each other very well. Add to that the expectation that someone will give and someone will receive gifts. Add to that the expectation that this year, above all other years, everything will be perfect, just perfect. You know what I mean? Things can fall apart pretty quickly, and often things do. In preparing for this sermon, I searched back through my own memory to see if I could think of a time when the Somerville family Christmas just fell to pieces, when everything went wrong and conflict erupted and violence broke out. I couldn't remember a thing. And so I sent this email to my brothers last week. "Dear Ed, Scott, Greg, Gray, and Billy, I'm preaching on peace this Sunday, and I'm working with the idea that conflict can erupt even in the best families. I'm thinking especially that the Christmas holiday is a recipe for relational disaster. But I can't seem to recall any Christmas when things got messy at the Somerville house. Can you? Any time when one of us threatened to beat the life out of another with a new hockey stick?" Now, I remember almost killing myself going off a jump with the skis Ed brought me from New Hampshire. I remember being embarrassed by the pitiful gift I gave to Scott one time, a homemade wool cap with a green felt pine tree glued to the front. I remember playing Skittle Bowl with Greg and Gray for hours one year, but unless I've blocked it, I can't remember a time when conflict erupted at Christmas. Help me if you can. Signed, Jim. I heard back from my brother Ed right away. Ed, who is a missionary in Mexico and probably the best Christian I know. He said, "Dear Jim, I'm having a hard time remembering where I left my glasses. I agree, though. I can't really remember a time when there was significant conflict, except that time when Gray, or was it Greg, found out about the boat we were building as a present for them. Remember, the mighty Mudcat? And I was tempted to, or did I actually, beat the stuffing out of them." Signed, Ed. I had to think for a minute to remember the mighty Mudcat, but I did. My two older brothers and I had found a set of wooden steps that somebody had thrown over the hill on that dirt road where we lived. We dragged them home, knocked the wooden treads off the stringer, nailed them to the other side so that when we were done, it looked sort of like a boat, more like a dugout canoe with big jagged teeth down both sides. It took 5 or 6 tubes of caulk and about 3 gallons of paint to make it watertight, but when we got finished, we could pole it up and down the muddy river that ran below our house, setting out trot lines in the hopes of catching catfish. That's why we called it the Mud Cat. Now, my 2 younger brothers, Greg and Gray, were jealous. They wanted a boat too. And so we decided to build one for them for Christmas. Eventually, my dad got in on the project, which means that instead of building the Mud Cat 2, we built something far more elaborate, requiring plans from Popular Mechanics magazine and fresh sheets of plywood from the lumber yard and epoxy resin that left us so dizzy we had to step out of the workroom from time to time just to clear our heads. All of this was being done in secret just down the hall from the kitchen, a Christmas present for the boys. And that's when the incident Ed referred to earlier occurred. But while his memory of it is rather hazy, Gray's memory of it is crystal clear. Listen to his email. Dear Jim, the only memory I have that may qualify as a Christmas quarrel was the year that you, Dad, Ed, and Scott built the boat for Greg and me. My memory is that the construction was going on in that back room down the hall from the kitchen that used to be Dad's study. My curiosity got the best of me, and I tried to sneak a peek at what was going on in that room. Ed caught me, picked me up by my shirt collar and the seat of my pants, threw me down the hallway, kicked me into the kitchen as I scrambled to my knees, and chased me down the hall into Mom and Dad's bedroom screaming threats. I managed to jump behind that couch in Mom and Dad's room before any further damage was done. That's all I remember. Signed, Gray. I don't think any lasting damage was done, and the boys got a nice boat for Christmas. But I want to point out something that seems relevant to this sermon on peace. It's that small detail that while Ed had trouble remembering whether or not he beat the stuffing out of one of his brothers and which of his brothers it was, Gray remembered everything perfectly, which lets me know that he had never been able to completely let go of that incident, no matter how much he might agree with Ed that he shouldn't have peeked. And maybe it's telling as well that Ed remembered somebody peeked, even if he couldn't remember who it was. Somebody violated the code of Christmas, and all these years later, that memory was still up there. I wrote back to Gray and asked, did Ed ever apologize for beating the stuffing out of you? But maybe I should have written to Ed as well to ask, did Gray ever apologize for peeking at the wonderful Christmas surprise? When I was teaching Greek to some of our church members a few weeks ago, we looked at the word aphiemi, which means to forgive. I told them that when I thought about that word, I always thought of phiemi as meaning to hold on to something, and aphiemi as letting go of it. I told them that little ah sound at the front of the word negates the meaning in the same way that when you say someone is apolitical, you mean they're not very political at all. So if phiemi is to hold on to some hurt someone has inflicted, some wrong that someone has done, then aphiemi is to let it go, to forgive it. The fact that my brother Gray still remembers the intimate details of his Christmas thrashing suggests that he has never really let go of that. The fact that Ed could remember he peeked in at the boat they were building suggests the same thing. Now, it's a little thing. It seems almost too trivial to discuss in a sermon. But the point I'm trying to make is that those little things can come between us. They can destroy the peace that exists between two people. I think this is why Jesus tells his disciples, you have heard that it was said by men of old, thou shalt not murder. But I say to you that if you are angry with your brother, you are liable to judgment.